we should just start. I'm gonna abandon my introduction. I'm gonna just say everyone is listening right now. This is the podcast, and I'm really excited to speak with Drilona Breçani. She's an immigration attorney and a Dickinson Law alum, class of 2011. Officially, thank you so much for joining us here. I know we're just getting into it now, and it's the first podcast you've been on, but this is my first podcast too, and we're speaking with Penn State alums. So thank you for jumping on here in such a chaotic time and joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me, and thank you for starting this initiative. I think it's a great thing, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's been quite a year, and I'm super excited to start this podcast and highlight a lot of alum of Penn State. And I'm really excited to get into your journey specifically. But before we kind of get into any of the highlights about Penn State and your career, I know that you have a really interesting story growing up in Albania, your childhood, and then immigrating to the United States. So can you perhaps go over what your childhood was like and maybe paint a picture for the first 15, 20 years of your life coming to America and how that all transpired?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Albania. At the time, Albania was a communist country. So, my childhood was a little bit different than, say, a lot of my classmates at Penn State, for example. But born and raised in Albania, and then my father in Albania, he was a judge, and my mom was a teacher. So I sort of always grew up wanting to emulate and follow in my father's footsteps. And we actually ended up moving to New York, to the US in 1997, when I was just almost 14 years old. So really, we moved here June 22nd of 1997, and within a month or two, I had to go to high school. And we ended up moving to the Bronx because that was where we could sort of afford to live in New York City at the time. And I went to high school in the Bronx. That summer, my sister and I actually ended up taking sort of a crash course, English ESL crash course, so that we could really, because we knew very basic English when we moved here. My parents didn't, and my sister and I knew very basic, terms and terminologies, how are you, where are you, this is a table, very limited. So really that month, July, August, before high school began, we took this ESL crash course, and then here we are, end of August, high school started, and I was a freshman, and my sister was a junior. So that was a little bit challenging, I'll be honest.
Oh, of course. I can only imagine. I mean, can you add a little bit more context into exactly how you got there? I believe it was from a lottery, correct?
Yes. Actually the U.S. government runs what's called the diversity lottery. So that's sort of like no one wins any money, but you sort of win a green card, which, if you ask me and a lot of other people across the world, that's way more valuable. So the diversity lottery, my father won the diversity lottery when we were still living in Albania. My father filled out this form that actually his friend asked him to apply for this lottery. And my father was like, no, we're not, we're fine here. And then it was sort of like a joke between the two of them, my dad and his friend. And, he fills out this form sort of last minute, and then he ends up getting picked in the lottery. So what that meant is that my dad, his spouse, right, and then the two children, thankfully my sister and I were both under 18. So that meant that we could all come to the US together. Wow. And so that's how, we moved over to the US. And actually, what's even when my dad got picked up for the lottery, the initial, because again, it was sort of like we didn't take it seriously. It was sort of a joke. We weren't going to take advantage of it initially. We weren't going to come to the US. And then in 1997, especially March of 1997, Albania was in a pretty dark place. There were, sort of the short version of it, there were these pyramid schemes that came tumbling down. And at that time, they were endorsed by the government. And once, the pyramid schemes fell, the majority of the Albanian population who had invested, and, a lot of them even sold their homes so they could, invest money for this huge return, right? Once all of this came crumbling down, essentially, there was sort of a, if you will, a civil war, or, pretty much there was chaos in the country in 1997, and March of 1997 was actually the worst of it. So my college essay, actually, I wrote about a lot of that part of my life. There were many nights when we actually would sleep on the floor instead of our beds because we were afraid of bullets that were just going and flying through, from people's apartments or balconies, etc. Because a lot of people broke into the national armories and people had weapons en masse.
Wow.
So it was very common to have your neighbor who had, a weapon and they're just shooting. So it was a very scary time. So that's when my dad actually, we had a family meeting and my dad was, wait, we have a ticket out of here. And legally, we had a legal way of, getting out of there and coming to the US legally. And said, we're not taking it. Like, that's actually reckless. So my dad, decided we should definitely, even, he said, even if we don't go to live in America forever, at least for the time being, because it's so dangerous to live here right now, we should go to the US.
Wow. So how long after the lottery was distributed did that kind of conversation happen?
So the lottery would have been, I think my dad got picked up at some point in 1996, so the year before. I don't have the timeline in my mind exactly, but I know it was the year before, because also for the lottery, you have to show up to the consulate for the visa, for the interview, so you can't sort of postpone it indefinitely. But I believe we at least postponed one of those, meetings because we just weren't sure that we wanted to even follow through. Right. And then once, the situation really deteriorated in the country and in Tirana, where we were living at the time, the capital, that's when my father, especially looking around and seeing how many other Albanians were leaving the country, even illegally, because it was dangerous. You couldn't really blame a lot of them because they just wanted to get to safety somewhere else. So I think looking around, my dad was like, wait, we have a legal way out of here and into the US. And we really should consider taking it.
Wow. I mean, that's a remarkable timeline of events just for all that to kind of fall into place. And I can only imagine the influence not only your parents had on you for your career trajectory, but just going through that. I mean, it only makes sense that now you are an immigration attorney. You went through some of probably the most trying times of that time period for your community that you grew up in. I mean, I can't imagine the relief and opportunity that had for you and your family.
Yeah, so definitely, growing up with my dad as a judge, I remember actually, at least in Albania at the time, it was allowed, like my dad would bring me to work sometimes. So I would go into courtroom and, pretend to know what I'm doing. So I would just sit there with my dad. So I think that's when it all began, where I, sort of as a child, I knew that I wanted to, follow in my father's footsteps. I didn't know that I wanted to become an immigration attorney. I think that sort of came later on. Obviously, some partly based on our own personal journey coming to the U.S. As immigrants, and obviously, in a way, the way we came is sort of the easy way, because honestly, if you win the diversity lottery, you come to the US and then within a month or two, you have a green card. If that's not the American dream, I don't know what is.
Right.
So many other people, and especially my clients today, it could take them a whole decade, right, before they ever get or see a green card. So I'm fully aware of that, of how blessed we were to win the lottery and get to this country in that way. But yeah, once we came here and once I, eventually decided to go to law school at Penn State, that's where I enrolled in the immigration clinic. And I think that's when it sort of solidified in my mind that, I think I would like to pursue immigration specifically.
Yeah. So you're living in New York, you're growing up, late 90s, early 2000s. What is, I mean, I moved to New York in 2016. So I'm on the crux of saying I'm a New Yorker, but I'm really not. What was New York like growing up? I mean, you mentioned it a little bit. You had to take some ESL classes to kind of get that foundation, so you felt a little bit more comfortable in high school. But what was like high school like growing up in New York in the late 90s?
I'll be honest, high school. So I ended up going to a public high school in the Bronx by virtue of, the neighborhood that we lived in. And I'll be honest, it wasn't one of the best, high schools that one could go to. It was actually not a very good high school academically, but also I recall we had to go through metal detectors every day. That was the kind of high school I attended. So we'd go through metal detectors, a lot of sort of security. There were, gangs also. So it was the kind of environment where you had to be sort of alert and careful. And that first year was incredibly difficult for me, I will admit.
Yeah.
Again, even though I took that crash course, it was clearly obvious to everyone that, I didn't speak English very well, which also then prevented me from making the kinds of friendships that I was accustomed to in Albania. Because if you can't really express yourself, that kind of, that makes that part difficult. So the freshman year was very difficult. I recall oftentimes going home and crying to my parents. Why did you bring us to this country? Let's go back home. So the first year was incredibly challenging academically, and also, right, just from, being a 14-year-old, a teenager, right? And you're uprooted and you have to start all over.
Wow.
So, but then I will say the next 3 years were incredibly, fulfilling and much better. Surprisingly, this is sort of a surprise to a lot of people, but who know me, I joined the cheerleading team in high school. And I think that was sort of my saving grace because, I just found my community and I made, a really good group of friends. And that is what sort of carried me through high school. And that was, it was very powerful. And somehow, I don't even know how this happened, but I became the cheerleading captain, and then I graduated as valedictorian of my high school. So there was a lot of tears, but a lot of hard work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't imagine. I know that high school it can be a challenging time for people who grew up in a small town and live the first 20 years of their life there. It could be challenging enough just getting through, like, the cultural aspects and just the social aspects, but to get kind of transplanted into that environment and have all that to like kind of work through. It's amazing that you were able to reposition and then graduate valedictorian, captain of the cheerleading squad, find your kind of way. It just it's pretty awesome that you were able to do that. And I can only imagine the next 4 years of your life how different that was than living in the Bronx. Because I believe you went to Georgetown, correct?
Correct.
So can you compare and contrast kind of like the differences? I mean, going from the Bronx to DC?
So again, how can one compare and contrast? They were, polar opposites, right? But and I'm so thankful for that. It's sort of having seen the polar opposites. I think what hopefully I'd like to think of myself as a well-rounded individual in terms of I've had friends. Best friends from all different types of walks, and it's to me it just makes for a more enriching life. But yes, it was very different. I think the one thing that stays with me, and it sort of at times makes me emotional, is when my parents took me to Georgetown, and we didn't have a car or anything at that time. So a cousin of us, a very close cousin of us, offered to drive us to Georgetown with my everything, right, when you're moving into college. And then we ended up walking around the Georgetown neighborhood. I now call it the Georgetown bubble, but the Georgetown neighborhood, and just walking around, seeing the shops and the streets and the beautiful homes, etc. And my mother at one point said, "Oh, okay, this is America." Wow. And I will never forget that, because to her, that was, we had made it through the first 4 years.
Yeah.
That always makes me emotional, that part.
I mean, that's what I mean when I said it's amazing that you kind of came through all that hardship and you worked hard. I mean, I can't imagine just the things that you had to embrace as a new individual in New York. I mean, for me, I grew up in Pennsylvania and I moved 2 hours over here, and it's still overwhelming. So hats off. I mean, it truly is like a really amazing story. And for you to graduate and have the opportunity to go to Georgetown and have your family see this kind of come full circle, I know in the mid 90s and the late 90s, that's probably what they thought. And it's just an amazing story. So I understand.
On a lighter, funnier note, when I went to Georgetown, because I was so accustomed to, like I said, living in the Bronx, you have to be very street smart, right? And you have to be alert, and you just have to, and then I sort of carried some of that. And to this day, I have it, which I think it's a great thing to have for a New Yorker, right? You have to be street smart, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So I kind of carried some of that. And of course, a little bit of, spunk, or some may call it attitude or whatever, right? So I think it definitely stood out a little bit. But again, I went to Georgetown and I found my people, and it was, a great experience. And it was very, I will say, my first year at Georgetown was very difficult. I would spend a lot of all-nighters. I would be in the library until 3 a.m. when so many of my friends were done at 10, again, because linguistically I still had some challenges, and a lot of my friends at Georgetown, a lot of them had went to private high schools, perhaps had tutors along the way, and that's a wonderful thing. But I realized that if I'm going to keep up with them, right, and do as well, that I need, if they need to maybe put forth 50%, I need to put forth 150% to be on the same playing field.
Wow. What's your motivation behind, giving 150%? Is it your family?
Yeah. For sure. For me, even to this day, it's sort of this is self-imposed. My parents are wonderful people. They've never, they always say, right, do your best, but aside from that, you're in charge of your own. But personally, having seen the struggles, right, and the sacrifices that they made in coming here and giving up their livelihoods and their careers and their families, essentially, for me, that is motivator number one, and always will be, right? Because I think in my mind, I'm always trying to sort of justify their sacrifice or make it worth their while, that this wasn't all for nothing, that we actually have come around and made a good life out of coming here.
Wow. That's amazing. And it's hopefully inspiration for other individuals who may be going through something similar or just need that kind of that extra push. Because family's number one, and they'll carry through a lot of different things. So did they help carry you through your time at Georgetown and then subsequently into Penn State? I'd love to see, because you went to Georgetown, it's a little bit more unique for Penn State alumni listening, because most everyone that we talked to went there for their bachelor's degree. So you graduate from Georgetown, and kind of walk me through what led you to Penn State, and if you immediately went there or you went through some internships, or how did that look?
Right. So I actually, once I graduated from Georgetown, and again, I knew I wanted to go to law school, but I took 3 years off after Georgetown and before Penn State. And partly because, again, Georgetown actually gave me a great scholarship, but there were a little bit of money that I accrued there. And I wanted to make sure that I paid off those loans from Georgetown. The remainder of it, the majority was the scholarship, but I wanted to make sure that I paid those off before accruing more loans, right, in law school. So that's why I ended up taking those 3 years off to study for the LSAT, to pay off the undergraduate loans. And I had applied to various different schools. And I think, and this is, hats off to Penn State, because I think my story resonated with Penn State as well. And, it was sort of apparent in their when they reached out to me to say, we really want you to attend our school, and this is partly why, like, you have such a unique, and so hats off to them, because there were so many other schools that, again, and all of us, right, we all have our different, our story to tell, but the fact that Penn State sort of highlighted that and appreciated that, it just made me think, this is the place for me, because, right, we all want to be sort of understood and validated, and sort of they led with that. So
Wow.
that was very encouraging to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that now, about 10 years later, you can kind of reciprocate that story to the Penn State community, because that's what it's all about. Just being able to share in this community. And the one thing that's lasting for me as a graduate is just how rich and thoughtful this community is. So it's really nice to see that perspective, because I never really got into a lot of details around kind of the admissions process and specifically for law school. So that's really cool that you were able to share that.
Yeah. And sort of after the initial, I think the first month, maybe my accent, everyone was like, "Oh, you're an international student, right?" And I was like, no, I'm just like you. I just have an accent.
Yeah, from the Bronx,
Right, because my accent, I suspect, I can't really hear my own accent, but I suspect it's it's a hot mess, right? It's a little bit of Albanian, it's a little Bronx, and who knows what.
Right, right, right. I'm curious, like when you were at Penn State and practicing, what was the course work like? What did you focus on, and were you like an on campus, or you were hybrid or virtual, or how did that work?
So I was at the University Park campus and in person, full time in person. And the first year of law school for every student is, the standard courses, right? None of us get to pick. It's the standard criminal law, constitutional law, property law. So that's, for everyone. And then once you get into your second year and your third year, that is when you can sort of start narrowing down, your preference in terms of, I think I would like to specialize in this practice area, and sort of try to tailor. There are still requirements along the way that you have to satisfy, but you do have a lot more flexibility in terms of the courses that you do take. For example, I stayed away from tax law as far as I could. Tax law, I just think, God bless whoever does that, but like I knew it wasn't for me.
Yeah.
So I took more immigration related courses. So for me in law school, it was either immigration law or employment law. Those were the two that resonated the most with me, and that's at Penn State. I also ended up enrolling in the immigration clinic with Professor Wadia, who's amazing. She does such an amazing job running that clinic. I think just being in the clinic and working with her, I think it just made me feel like this is something that I would like to further explore after law school and pursue. And actually, one other thing about that Penn State made possible in a way, which is amazing. My first year out of law school, when we all are looking right for internships, and some of us are looking for those big law firm internships, I was actually going somewhat on a different tangent. I ended up doing an internship with the FBI.
Yeah, I
In
wanted to ask
Washington,
about that.
D.C.
That stands out a little interesting.
Yeah, so it's like, again, what a great opportunity that I only, got to explore because of Penn State.
Wow. So what was that in the midst of your degree, your law degree, or was it immediately after?
So once you've completed the first year of law school, right, that first year, that summer for every law student is sort of the crucial summer in terms of where do you intern for the summer. And like I said, most law students want to intern at a law firm. And that makes perfect sense, right? Why you would want to do that. But for some reason, I was just fascinated by the FBI. And I saw that, I had just sort of, again, kind of like with the diversity lottery, I just sent an email. I was like, yeah, I think I'm interested. Or just like with us here today.
Right.
So I tend to do that a lot. I raise my hand and then I freak out later. So I just, applied for the FBI. And again, I thought this is never going to go anywhere, but why not? And, they reached out, and then just I had to get top secret clearance, even as an intern. Apparently, you need top secret clearance. So it took about 8 to 9 months to get the top secret clearance. And I think part of it was also complicated by the fact that I was born and raised in a different country, so it would take them longer. But at one point, there was actually a special agent, an FBI special agent that came to Penn State to interview some of my professors and to interview my roommates. I had no idea they were coming. And then after the fact, my roommates told me, there is an FBI agent that pulled us aside to ask questions about you, because obviously, right, they want to make sure that whoever's getting top secret clearance is, the kind of person they want to give it to.
Wow. I love watching movies with that kind of backstory, and just to have it come to life, it must be kind of surreal. I mean, just having them come and it's true what they have in the movies, like they do that kind of background checking.
I honestly never expected that. but it happened. And turns out there's actually an FBI office in State College. Who knew?
Wow.
Because
Wow.
after my summer internship, I ended up working for them throughout the academic year as well, because we had a great working relationship. So, but again, these are the things you just sort of stumble upon as through life, as you keep raising your hand for things that you're probably scared to do, but also scared to pass up.
Right.
So you keep raising your hand and then see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, I wish um, you kind of summed it up perfectly about you never know what can become of a situation until you try it. So that's really cool that you were able to just give it a chance and see how it kind of shaped you for all these other opportunities that come in the future. And I can only imagine how that lined you up for the rest of your career, then having that experience with the FBI. And I mean, I have to ask, like, well, whatever you can share, was the FBI like, what was it like in a general sense? I mean, comparatively to your other classmates who may have got experience from a law firm, what was the differentiator for you, and how did that kind of impact the rest of your career?
So it's interesting. So obviously, even though now I work right at a big law firm, so I'm definitely not, working for the FBI or anything like that. It was a wonderful experience just to meet all sorts of people, to be in Washington, D.C. that summer, and just to be in this right institution where there's so much sort of mystery around it. And obviously as an intern, there's only so much visibility you have to certain things, but still the fact that you must obtain a top secret clearance and you still have a good amount of, visibility is just like, what an honor that is to begin with. Right. And I will say that it was actually fascinating to find out that a lot of lawyers, right, they had gone and worked at the big law firms, et cetera. And then within 5 to 10 years, they quit the law firm route and ended up working at the FBI. So that's actually always sort of been in the back of my mind. It's been a very enriching experience on so many fronts. And again, even if you don't end up pursuing that experience, again, I didn't. I had
Right.
an amazing experience, but I went the more corporate route because for me that made more sense. And I actually brought up this example the other day because I have two mentees from Penn State Law, and they're right now applying for their, summer internships and trying to figure out. So they were asking, what did you do? How did you decide? And I said, honestly, there is value in going sometimes going the road less traveled.
Right.
Again, if you can get that big law firm internship, kudos, right? That's incredible. That's amazing. And you will have a more straightforward trajectory, right? As a lawyer.
Right.
I didn't because I was fascinated by this and I went on a different tangent. And so many people said, ooh, that's risky. Don't you really, But every single interview I went to after that, it was the one thing, if nothing else, I mean, also my background, et cetera, but it was the one thing that always kept coming up and it was fascinating to people. And it was just like, if nothing else, it was, something that stood out, right? And they remembered you by. So this
Yeah.
is what I told my mentees. Sometimes there's value in taking the road less traveled.
Yeah. I love that. That would have been part of one of the questions I wanted to ask. And you know, diversifying your portfolio, your human portfolio.
Yes.
I mean, the kind of stereotypical way is maybe not it may be a safe way in some regards. It may be an easier way in some regards, but you seem to want to constantly challenge yourself and try something different, and that definitely speaks to kind of who you've become now.
Yeah, I just feel like, right, it's important to follow our interests and our passions, right? And also, because that will also lead you. So it's okay to go explore and then figure out, oh, that doesn't quite work for me, or this is why that's not best suited, and then sort of recalibrate. But, to just not pursue sort of that gut instinct or something that just keeps pulling you just because the corporate world or, the standard, is telling you this is the only way that it can be done. That's not accurate, especially not in today's world. Like, look at us. I've been working from home for the last year.
Yeah.
Had you asked any lawyer, any big law firm a year before, can the lawyer's job, can this be done, or any job, right? Most jobs, can this be done from work, full-time, home?
Right.
And everyone would have said no. And now look, all of us.
Yeah. Well, that sets up kind of this second aspect that I wanted to get in, just how your attorney and corporate life has, after the FBI, after you kind of got your legs in the corporate world, how has that been over the last couple of years? I know you lived in, I believe, Toronto for a few years, and then you kind of made your way full circle back to New York, which I love that. How, leading up to 2020 and the pandemic, what was your corporate attorney life like, just in perspective?
Yeah, so even that, right, has been a little bit different from a lot of my peers. So after law school, my first job out of law school was at a small immigration law firm in the city, in Manhattan, and I worked there for approximately 3 years. But I knew it was sort of too small for my ambitions in life, and I just knew I had to, figure out my next move. And lo and behold, I saw this this role in Toronto, Canada for, with Ernst & Young. And again, right, I raised my hand and I was, I just raised my hand and I sent this application. And again, I was like, this is not going to go anywhere because I never in a million years thought I would live in Canada. Like we had, we came to the US to live here. Right. Long story short, I go there for an interview. They ask, oh, what are your ties to Toronto, Canada? And I was like, I have none. They're like, oh, okay, great. So then I was convinced they're never going to hire me because, and long story short, I ended up getting the job. I lived in Toronto, Canada for 3 years. What an amazing experience professionally and from a personal standpoint. And again, there were a lot of colleagues or friends who thought, why would you leave New York City, right? I was working in New York City at the time. Why would you leave New York City to go to work in Toronto, Canada? So again, there's so many times where, to me, I knew it. It felt right. It was the right move professionally. I was going from a small boutique law firm to this gigantic corporation. I just knew it without any doubt that it was the right move. But there were a lot of people around me who thought, that was, again, risky, not the standard, the road less followed, right. Traveled, if you will. And that is exactly sort of what set me up to come back to where I am today, Fragomen, Del Rey, which for immigration purposes is, sort of where everyone wants to end up. If you're doing immigration, if you're doing business immigration, Fragomen is where you want to end up, right? So that was always my goal once I got started in business immigration. And again, I figured out this is how am I going to end up at Fragomen? And if I have to go, the road less traveled, I will do that. And that's how I ended up at Fragomen. And initially it was their New Jersey office. And actually May of 2020, I transferred to the New York office, from the New Jersey office to the New York office. And it's interesting because I've actually physically been into the New York office maybe once or twice. Because, right, in May of 2020, the pandemic was, on full blast. Yeah. So even though I transferred offices, we've all been working from home. So my team today, I have met one colleague in person, and everyone else, right? It's all been, the interviews were through Zoom. So it's very interesting, but somehow it's incredible how we've all made it work. And
Yeah.
we've worked harder this year, I think, than any other year. So that's a whole separate discussion, right? But in terms of productivity,
Right.
it's been amazing.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my other questions that you're leading into so gracefully is, how COVID has changed the way you work on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps in a more like you mentioned that you're not typically in the courtroom, but generally, has it made you said more productive in ways, but it was also like how has that transition been made from in the office to at home virtually? And I know as I'm in the same boat, but as a lawyer and an attorney, I was curious if that is the same. Was it easier? Was it more difficult? How has it been?
So I think, I'll be honest, attorneys are not like the most tech savvy people in the world, especially this one. So, right, initially I was a little bit anxious about it because it's like, right, I have a full on office right here. I have monitors and printers and scanning. So this is a full on office, which is amazing, right? We get to do everything from home that we're able to do at work. That being said, once we're able and allowed to go back to the office, I think I'll be the first one to go back because I'm a social person. I like to be amongst my colleagues, especially, right? I haven't really met most of my colleagues on this new team. And so I'm definitely one of those people that I'm looking forward to going back to the office. But in terms of the workflow and productivity from home, again, they've set us up so that there is, right, no glitches. We have monitors, print, like I can do everything from home that I was able to do at the office. I will say, I think generally speaking, for anyone, it's great. And that obviously I came in to the New York office and to sort of the, working from home scenario as an experienced attorney, because I do sympathize a little bit, like if you're more of a junior attorney or a junior professional at whatever your job is, and you're just sort of finding out how to do your job, but you're sort of at home where it can feel a little bit isolating. You can't just walk into your colleague's office and say, hey, quick question, right? So I do sympathize with them at times, and I'm grateful that sort of to be, that I walked into this with experience where you don't feel as perhaps maybe disadvantaged as some of the more junior colleagues.
Yeah, no, that's a really valid point. I mean, I graduated in 2011 too with my bachelor's, so I'm in the workforce for 10 years, and working from home was an easier transition than just graduating or being in the workforce for 2 or 3 years. You're spot on with that osmosis that you get in the office. It definitely helps grow you and provide more experience than you wouldn't necessarily get if you're behind kind of like a screen all day.
Exactly.
But with that said, I think we've definitely, as a society and in business, we were challenged with this virtual world, and we to a certain extent, a lot of companies are embracing the virtual and the hybrid work from home for the future. I definitely get more done, and I love that there's no commute into the city. But on the other hand, like, you do miss out on your kind of the environment with your colleagues, the water cooler conversations, that kind of thing. So one day we'll get back to some normalcy. But what is for individuals who watch television and movies, what's a typical day for you, like as an immigration attorney? Can you kind of walk me through what a day-to-day is like?
So I will say, in a way, that's actually never a dull moment, because especially this last year, right? Or first of all, the last few years with the prior administration that has kept us on our toes. So it's made the practice, a lot more dynamic, but also challenging in a way. And obviously the last year with the pandemic and all of the U.S. consular closures and delays across the world, it has had a major impact on our, on our day-to-day because, and again, most of my day from 9 to 5, I'll be honest, most of it is meetings, emails, and calls with clients, right? And sort of the travel restrictions. So a lot of times when I used to kind of joke a little bit, but before, years ago, if a client, would say, hey, can I travel? It was a much more straightforward answer. And now, because of some immigration travel bans, and then you have the COVID health travel bans, right? And in my mind, it's like, well, which travel ban would you like to be subject to? Because there's so many right now, right? And it's like A, B, C, D, and then if this, then this. So the practice area has become a lot more challenging, but it's also what makes it interesting and dynamic, right? So I will say most of the day is really just managing, right, the calls and emails, and then sort of when you have a moment to sort of just focus, then get into the case law and case review and strategy, etc. But it's a very fast-paced practice area, and I think also that's what I like about it. Sometimes I joke that if I'm out of the office one day, I feel like I've missed like 2 new guidances and 2 new memos, and right. So I think that's what makes it fascinating. But again, it's for to each their own. If you're the kind of individual that sort of thrives in that fast-paced environment, then this is a good practice area to be in. If you like something more, not as fast-paced, then perhaps not, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm trying to think of if you, I know it may be difficult, but what's like the most, has there been a case or a point in your career that has been the most rewarding so far that you may want to highlight if you can, or are they all kind of equally as, close to you? And is there anything that you would love to highlight as far as your cases or your career goes so far?
So in terms of, it's interesting because actually the one case that often comes to mind, it's at my very first job, and it was actually an asylum case. And the reason why I tend to bring up this case, again, they're all, sort of unique in their own way, right? Because, and this is what I love about business immigration, is that there's the corporate side, which I enjoy being in the corporate world, right? And having a corporate client. But then within that corporate client and that corporate structure, you have the employees, the actual individuals who, we're applying, for employment visas for, right? And we're trying to get them green cards and trying to have them stay in the US, whether it's for 6 years or whether forever, right? So I get to have both the corporate and the individual equally. And that's what makes this, a good practice area for me. So that's why I feel like they're all unique and special in their own way, because every person is unique and special in their own way. So therefore that approval is as well. But I highlight this case, which was one of my first few cases as a lawyer, and it was an asylum case. It's not even what I do today, right? Today I do corporate immigration, the business side of things. But this was an asylum case, and after a lot of work and research, and again, this was my first one, I won the case. And actually the individual, she reached out to me on LinkedIn, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago maybe, which was like several years later, and just to say, you have no idea what it meant to me. I just got I got a new job at this company, and that would have never been possible without the green card that you helped secure for me. Again, I thought, this case was approved and closed a long time ago, right? And to have her reach out to say right? Like, she's like, I'm able to get this job with this employer years later because of the green card you helped secure for me. It's very meaningful. But also, the reason I bring it up is because I was very clear with this client when we had our initial meeting, and I said, look, this is my first asylum case. I'm not here to say I'm the most experienced attorney you've ever had. This is my first asylum case. So I want you to know that. But I also want you to know, in a way, my life story and how hard I work. And if anyone can research and read and work hard, it's me, and I will do that for you. And maybe that experienced attorney, right, perhaps won't even work as hard because, maybe they're not as motivated. And she trusted me and she stayed with me. And then we won the case. And that was part of her email that said, wow, you were honest with me and you said, this was your first case, but somehow I trusted you because I trusted that integrity that you would, work hard. So that's why I bring that up. And also for law students, there will be cases that, right, it's like a first, or, you're going to be terrified or whatever, but always be honest. Don't ever, or if you don't know the answer, say, let me go back, let me research it. I want to give you don't ever pretend that you know something that you don't, because it always carries through and people appreciate honesty and integrity. And she did.
Yeah, that has to be extremely fulfilling to hear that story kind of come full circle. I mean, that's really awesome, that feeling and that the gratitude she displayed then years after, and just knowing, right. I mean, that's really cool. What is a common maybe misconception about perhaps immigration that the general public may not see on the news or see just in different situations? Is there any kind of thing that you would like to highlight for people that may be that you can kind of clarify?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So I think there are sort of two things. So when people think immigration attorney, they oftentimes think family immigration, or right, they think what's happening at the border, deportations. And again, that's obviously what's reported mostly in the news, and so I don't blame people sort of for automatically thinking that. But there is this other side of immigration, right? The corporate business side of immigration, where we work with big corporate clients, companies, right, that have offices all over the world, right? And they're looking to bring people from, Europe or Asia or wherever in the world, bring them to the US to work here on, different types of projects. So I just want people to be aware, right, that there is this corporate side of immigration, what's called sort of the global mobility, and that, we have people, these companies that operate across, globally, right, that want to bring, whether it's one individual or they want to bring 50 engineers over for this big project, right? So, that's one thing that, there is this other side of immigration. And the other thing to bring up is that there are, especially with employment, immigration, and employment green cards, there are a lot of restrictions and parameters and rules around, sort of wages and protecting the U.S. labor market, because this sometimes gets, again, unless you're in the practice area, you wouldn't know. But whenever I hear arguments about, some immigrants sort of undercutting the wages for U.S. workers, et cetera, at least in my practice area and with my corporate clients, et cetera, that is, not the case. Again, even if they wanted to, right, which they don't, but even if they wanted to, there's so many rules and restrictions around it that we have to abide by, et cetera, that I don't think sort of the layperson realizes. But, there's a lot of, parameters around that specifically, right, to protect the U.S. labor market, as we should. And then lastly, there's sort of a lot of forms involved in the immigration practice area, and a lot of individuals get sort of fooled into thinking, oh, it's just a form. I can fill out a form. But you know, a lot of times, like, what you don't realize is the strategy of, you know, which form you should fill out, how you should answer. It's like, should you travel? Should you not? It's, you know, and I often say I haven't, you know, myself filled out a form in so long because, right, we have people, you know, like, you know, within the company, you know, our wonderful paralegals, et cetera. Like, I'm here to like catch, you know, to strategize the case and to really focus on, you know, any issues, how do we address the issues, and how do we, you know, best present your case. So I think people get fooled into thinking, oh, I can do this myself. And it's like one of the biggest mistakes. Even as a lawyer, if I'm operating outside of my practice area, I will hire a lawyer. So if I have a real estate matter, I'm going to hire a real estate attorney. If I have, right? Because
Right.
I understand what it takes and the nuances and the things that, you know, we don't realize unless you're fully operating within that practice area on a day-to-day basis.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you have to be, I think lawyers have to be very, very careful. And it's really interesting that you are saying that you need to, if you're focusing in a specific area, you need to be almost like humble and say like, okay, I don't know outside of these boundaries what is going to work and what may not, or what's right and wrong.
Because, right, if you want something done well, you need to go to the expert. It's sort of like saying, and again, I've had so many people, you know, where it's like, oh, you're a lawyer, and say, you know, I'm getting divorced, and I'm like, right, but I'm not like a divorce. I'm not a family attorney, so sure, I can give you a, you know, general, right, but it's like you have to be exactly humble enough to know this is my expertise. This is business immigration is my expertise, what I do day to day.
Yeah.
And, you know, what I really, you know, feel comfortable and equipped to advise on. Everything else is like, I can, but like, really, if you want the best service, and you should go to the expert that does that on a day-to-day basis, right? It's like going to the dentist and saying, hey, I don't know, I have heart issues, right? Heart problems, right? So
right, or going to the doctor, your general physician, and then like you have something specific with your knee that you have to get fixed.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love the just the smarts that and the research that you have to put into it. I mean, it can be a lot. I admit fully, I wish I read a lot of contracts myself, but I'm sitting there when they are being reviewed by your lawyer. They have a lot riding on those words and how they're phrased, and it's a lot of reading and researching, and you have to be a special kind of person with a lot of patience, I think, to be able to sit and read through all that.
Definitely a lot of patience, definitely a lot of reading. Yeah, I feel like anytime I read a contract, again, right, I'm not a contract attorney. I did take contract law in law school, so a lot of that comes back. But yeah, I definitely read it with sort of a different eye, just a sort of something of a funny example that you may appreciate. I was going a few years ago to lease a car with my sister, and she was like, oh, this will be a quick in and out. You just sign the contract, like 5 minutes. I'll wait for you in the car, right?
Yeah.
She calls me like 30 minutes later. She goes, what are you doing? Like, why is it taking you so long to sign this contract, right? And I was like, because I'm actually reading every word of it. And she was on one hand laughing, but right, because as a lawyer, you put a contract in front of me. Again, I'm not a contract attorney, but I'm still going to read it with a certain eye or skepticism or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And I went back to them and I said, hey, I see there's an arbitration clause in here, and I'm not comfortable signing off on this. Is there a way to like remove that or do something about it? They had to call the manager, go back, and then they came back to me laughing. And then they said, you are the second person who's asked us about this arbitration clause and, you know, wanting to remove it, etc. And I was like, who is the other person? They were like, a judge, a 75-year-old judge.
That's amazing.
So, you know, just sometimes I wish, I, I didn't, but it's like once you've sort of been trained that way, it's sort of difficult to bypass it or to glance over it.
Yeah, yeah,
For better or for
especially.
worse.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. I think a lot of people kind of get taken advantage of, or if they maybe were a little bit more aware of certain things, they can avoid things down the line. I mean, just personally, I know COVID kind of changed a lot of things. I'm getting married later this year, and a lot of our contracts with vendors,
Congratulations.
thank you. A lot of our contracts, they didn't have a COVID clause, and that has came up continually over the last 12 months about, rescheduling. How does that affect everything? Deposits. I mean, there's a lot that changed in the events world over the last year.
Right, right. And I feel like I've actually been reading up so many articles saying that a lot of couples right, have become increasingly frustrated with this. And a lot of them are just at the end of the day sort of foregoing that and just, getting married. But no, it's a very difficult landscape to sort of, to sort of explore and maneuver. So that's why, right, it's always best to the extent that one can, right, to go to the expert, or if not, at least just by reading it carefully, even as a layperson, if you just slow down and try to read, right, more carefully, maybe you have more thoughtful questions to ask, right?
Right.
To the other party, even if ultimately you don't have the power or, the whatever to change. But
Yep.
yeah.
At least you're aware. No, I agree wholeheartedly. It's once you kind of, after your college years are over and you become a more mature adult,
Like
those
an adult.
contracts, yeah, they really matter.
Once you start adulting,
Yes.
words matter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, before we wrap up here, I know we talked a lot of extensively, personally, your experiences. Is there any? I mean, Penn State has the "We Are" phrase. Do you have any personal mantra that you abide by that you would like to share, or advice that you'd like to give maybe students or individuals who's listening to this, young or old? Like any words of wisdom that you can kind of share with them?
So it's interesting because when we first got on this call, what did I say? I said, "Live in the dream," right?
Right.
And as we talked about this, I've always said that half jokingly, half actually meaning it. But living the dream is sort of my go-to. And in the past year, even more so, whenever people ask, "How are you?" I feel like I've resorted to that even more, living the dream. And then one day I was like, why am I saying that? Or like, why am I really saying that? And like, even to write to the students at Penn State, like, it's actually, if you think about it, it's a privilege, right? To be going to school. It's a privilege to be going to such a great institution like Penn State. So even though we all get caught up in the day-to-day, right? As a student, as a professional, the day-to-day grind, where it does not feel like a privilege. You're just trying to get through, right? One task at a time, one assignment at a time, one case at a time. So that's very real, but it's also just like so important to just think, like, honestly, right now, I would love to be a student, right? Like when I was a student, I never said that. I was like, oh, I can't wait to like start working and making money and all these assignments, right? And now I'm like, wow, what a privilege to like take 4 years out of your life to go to school, to learn, to better yourself. Not everyone has that, right? Like we tend to sort of forget about that, especially if you look around, not just in this country, but around the world. So if we just step back and think, yes, the grind doesn't feel good, but I will make it to the other side, and it is a privilege, and we are living the dream. If you're going to school at Penn State or wherever you are, if you're a professional working where you are living the dream, at least someone else's dream, but hopefully it's yours as well, right? So it's just, that's sort of my own personal mantra. And sometimes, depending on the day, sometimes I'm being just ironic and like it's more of a sort of a joke, like living the dream. And some days I fully mean it, but like I that's sort of my consistent phrase.
Yeah.
Perhaps to also remind myself that, this is, at least for me, this is the American dream, right? Like this is why we came, and I'm grateful to be, where I am today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it, and I love your story and everything you shared today. Really, I think will provide people with a lot of context, a lot of motivation and inspiration. And I couldn't be more happy to have had the opportunity to speak with you today and for you to share your story.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And again, for having started this project, which is so needed, especially right now. So kudos to you on this as well.
Awesome. Thanks again so much for being a part of it, and hope to stay in touch.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.